We are talking with Christopher Mattar, who is the developer behind the 3MS multi-material system. Morning, Christopher. How are you?
Good, how are you?
I'm doing pretty well. So I was looking through some options. Um, I would like to have a multi-material system for at least one of my printers. Um, and I need something relatively simple. I only want to do a few colors. So something like the Enraged Rabbit Carrot Feeder is a little bit more complexity that I'm looking for. So I saw some of your software work that you were using with another MMS system, um, and then saw that you were developing your own. And I wanted to talk with you about the 3MS system.
Yes. So I originally made the 3MS after I purchased a 3D Chameleon. I created a Clipper plugin for it, and then I eventually got to the point where I couldn't get the 3D Chameleon to work with my printer, whether it be software communication or hardware gripping the film and the filament splitter. And since I didn't want to deal with the complexity of a filament selector, even though the 3D Chameleon is fairly simple compared to other systems, it still has that selector. So I decided to just use the simplest method I could think of.
Right. So your system, as compared to most things like the 3D Chameleon or the ERCF, rather than having a physical selector, uses an extruder per filament path.
Yes, the extruders used are the same ones on the Ender 3, so they're fairly cheap, and when each filament is selected, it's synchronized with the printer's extruder to make it so that so the printer's extruder isn't dealing with extra drag.
So it would seem that the 3MS is a good option if you're looking to do a limited number of filaments, because of what you're essentially doing is you're replacing the complexity of a selector with redundancy so that you've got an extruder per filament. So it might not be a great option for someone who wants 8 colors or something, but very good for somebody that only wants a few.
Yeah, the current setup, the first controller I had support for with the 3MS was the SKR Mini, and that one has 4 stepper plugs. My setup currently uses 3 filaments, but I think 4 is the close to the crossover point where other systems like the ERCF become more cost effective.
For somebody like me, I mean, I almost considered doing a 2 filament. Um, because one of the biggest things for me, which I know is something you're implementing, is endless spool. So you can do that on 2 filaments very easily. But even for color change, most of the things that I'm going to do are only going to be two. But I have decided to go up and do 3 colors.
Yeah, I started with 2 filaments, then worked up to 3. And I would say around sometime last week, I did a large test print with endless spool and with a single filament sensor setup, and that proved to be mostly reliable. The main failure point right now is the fact that my filament sensor, because it's a mechanical one, it has a certain delay to it, and it sometimes false triggers. But I was able to run endless spool, run through 3 spools, and then internally reset the spools and load up more spools while the printer was still running. So I went through on 6 spools.
Excellent. So why don't you kind of step us through what's involved in building a 3MS?
Okay, so the first step with building a 3MS is choosing your controller. Like I said earlier, the SKR Mini has can you can use up to 4 filaments. There are other controllers like the SKR Pico, which might be slightly cheaper and have the same number of filaments. You could Someone did a pull request to add a G-Tech controller board that actually allows for up to 7 filaments. But really it's up to you which controller you want. Because if you want to run extra heaters with another power supply, you could you might want another, like a controller like an octopus. And then if you don't want to buy an extra controller and you have spare ports, like on an octopus, you can just use that. And then after you get your bill of materials, you have to get the controller bill of materials and the filament unit. Bill of materials, you get one per color you want to print with. And then you just assemble the MK8 extruders onto the stepper motors, wire them up to the main board, and then proceed to flash clipper firmware. Before I get too much into the software, I want to point out that they're on the 3MS documentation, very simple flat mounts for the MK8 extruders. So if you have a spare aluminum extrusion or your printer's frame uses them, you can use that to mount it. And then once you connect the motherboard, you flash Clipper, you download the 3MS configuration, which has an automated install script. And then you go through some tuning, like making sure your stepper motors are working, they're going the right way, the right distance. And then slicer setup is fairly simple. It's just a matter of increasing your filament number, your filament or extruder count. And then after that, you can generally just start a test print and see if you need to tune tip shaping or try out no tip shaping or further tuning like that.
Okay. Yeah, I had briefly thought about trying to run the steppers from my octopus, um, but I didn't have enough ports open, and I could have done it if I moved some of my motors over to CAN, but it seemed like at that point, you know, I'm installing CAN boards to control the motors to free up more ports on the octopus when I have an SKR3 sitting here doing nothing. So So I'm going to use an SKR3. I think it's a V2. Um, Going to go a little bit differently than what you're describing. First of all, I'm converting the SKR to CAN just to simplify the wiring from my printer to the control board. And I'm going to be using BMG clones. So they're a dual gear extruder.
Yeah, BMG clones are actually on the something I want to try out because the current dual gear extruders I have aren't working too great with TPU. I'm working through other just printer issues with getting TPU to print normally, but I think if I go to a fourth filament, I'm gonna try out those BMG extruders to see if there's any other benefits to replace the standard single gear ones on the bill of materials.
Well, if I get to it before you do, I'll I'll give you some feedback on that. Unfortunately, I'm kind of juggling, a number of projects right now, so I don't have as much time as I want to dedicate just to the 3MS, but I'm definitely getting there.
Okay, thank you.
So one of the things that I also like is that you've added integration for Klipperscreen.
Yeah, I actually have my Klipperscreen right here. I'm not sure how well this is gonna work, but the camera isn't picking that up too well, but there are screenshots on the documentation, and it essentially is a modified version of the extrude panel with extra controls for the 3MS. You can alter all of the settings like the distances and speeds, the filament sensor delays, and then it also shows you what the 3MS thinks it's doing right now, which which tool is synchronized and which filament it thinks is loaded, which in my testing has proved very useful, recovering a failed tool change because I loaded the wrong material up.
Yeah, no, I run Klipperscreen on two of my three printers, the third one someday, but having that integration in there directly will be great. So let's take a look at a couple examples of some prints that you've done with the 3MS.
So this is the sheep that's used actually as the Prusa MMU demo print. The black and white, this is with a lot of wipe tower. The color transition is nice, and the color swaps were actually very fast with the 3MS. This is another multicolor print, again, a light color and a dark color. And then this is one of the hardest test prints in my opinion because the legs are very fragile. This was done with protopasta, which is in my testing very hard to get tip shaping to work, but 3MS was able to handle it.
Excellent. Those look really good.
Thank you. I think the main one I need to work on is the penguin because there's actually white bleeding into the black, which I need to fix in the purge.
Yeah, it seems like once you have one of these systems up and running, then you get to go down the rabbit hole of tuning.
Maybe that's why the ERCF is called Enraged Rabbit Carrot Feeder. Every MMU is a rabbit hole of sorts.
And you had mentioned that you were looking for Happy Hare integration as well.
Yes, so quick background, Happy Hare is the firmware that runs the ERCF. It's a very robust firm Clipper control for an MMU system. I reached out to the developer of it, and they said currently there's support for it internally, but currently the configuration isn't exposed. But as soon as that becomes available, I'll work on updating the documentation and migrating the 3MS over. Because Happy Hair also has an integrated clipper screen. It has a lot more filament sensor options, has a filament cutter option, and is definitely more robust and better for the long term.
Yeah, I mean, I've looked over some of your other stuff, which we can talk about your other projects in a minute. But just having an entire community working on that firmware would be great than everything sitting just on your shoulders.
Yeah, also because I don't necessarily have the hardware to test all the feature requests, and having other people with different setups would definitely help, like to get different features tested. I'm actually working on getting the Creality K1 firmware and getting the 3MS working with the K1. And since I don't have one, it's a lot of back and forth with someone who does have a K1.
Yeah,
But it seems like Happier is actually working on K1 support, so that's another thing that will just be automatically done when I migrate over.
cool. And I wanted to check because I was unclear on setting things up in the slicer. Is it possible to set up multiple profiles so that there's a single extruder option versus running through the 3MS? Basically, what I'm looking for is potentially, because I'm doing a three filament system, if I have a four PTFE combiner, can I essentially use one of those just as a bypass?
I'm going off of memory here, but the I'm pretty sure the only thing you should have to change in the profile is you'd have to remove the MMMS start G code from your print start, which you may need to make a second print start macro without the MMMS start in it, and then you can run that on the single profile. So that'll just make the 3MS run in neutral. And as long as your filament is loaded from the start, that should work. I can do more internal testing and looking through G code.
Okay. Just because I'm thinking, there are times where I just need to print off one part really quickly, especially if I need to do one part in a color where it might be nice to have that option rather than having to unspool things and reload everything if there was a bypass to just be able to go, I'm going to put this one filament in on a separate spool and just go.
Yeah, and that's also another feature of Happy Hair, which again is why I want to migrate to there as soon as possible. So yeah, I can do more testing on that. I'm pretty sure that's all I need to do, change the start cheat code, but I can get back to you on that.
Okay. And I had mentioned your other software. So can you tell us a bit about the other Clipper projects you've worked on?
The other Clipper projects I've worked on are dynamic macros and Clipper maintenance. So dynamic macros is a system that it started as a system that lets you change macros inside of Clipper without restarting it. But now it has a bunch of other features that standard macros don't have, like ability to do recursion, You can run Python from a macro, and you can update the macro with the printer state as you move on. That's more geared towards developers listening in. And that makes it really useful for making macros do what you previously would have to make a Clipper extra for. But I actually do have a Clipper extra tutorial on dynamic macros as well. And then Clipper maintenance is just simple maintenance reminders for your 3D printer. I actually had my extruder maintenance one go off earlier today. You can change the You can make it trigger after a certain number of print hours, certain length of filament, or just arbitrary time.
And that shows up as uh, a
It's
clipper screen warning, or how does that work?
So the default implementation is where there's just a text in the console, in the Clipper console, but you can also I believe this is still experimental, but you can also define a custom G code to run. So there are G code. You can use the respond command to invoke a prompt on mainsail, fluid, or Clipper screen.
Okay, I will definitely be looking into that because if we can do a custom G code, then it would be really easy to integrate a mobile raker notification as well.
Oh, that's a good point. I don't I haven't used Mobile Raker, but I have heard a lot about it.
Mobile
So that's
raker
good.
is very cool, and yeah, it's a very simple G code command that would then send that notification out through mobile raker as well.
Okay. Yeah, that should be possible through the custom G codes.
Excellent. Well, cool. Well, thank you for taking some time to talk about the 3MS. I'm really looking forward to getting it up and running on my system. Um, I'm building a dry box for my filament that also includes the buffers that I need. So as soon as I get that done, I may wind up mounting my extruders directly to that. So I've got some details to figure out, but
Okay, I saw your video on that. I think I'm actually going to modify my dry box to use those spool holders and re
yeah,
auto rewinders.
yeah, it's a really nice kind of self-contained thing. I know a lot of people are, looking at well, what is the name? Is the filamentalist, which is
Oh
like
yeah.
an automated. It's a manual rewinder kind of thing, but I'm fine with the old school buffers. But that dry box seems to work really well.
Okay, I was gonna say I'm also thinking about designing some sort of clip-on or bolt-on buffer to the directly to the extruder because most of my filaments print straight from my enclosure. I have three spool holders in there, and I think just a simple like clip-on to the extruder arm and then a buffer would be really helpful for more like crammed setups.
Yeah, it'd be good to have a number of options. Sort of what I'm thinking is seeing if I can mount those BMG clones directly to the uh, the front of that enclosure, so that I'm coming directly out of the dry box into the extruder, and I'm toying around with the idea of putting that on top of the printer because then I could also have a pretty lazy, filament path to go into the combiner and then directly into the frame.
That sounds like a really efficient system. Generally the shorter the PTFE tubes are and the gentler the curves, the better. I've actually had some issues with that in the past.
Yeah, so I'm trying to do as much as I can to minimize the length of that path, and as you said, sort of keep those curves kind of gentle. So we'll see how it goes. Well, thanks again for taking some time out of your day to talk about the project. I look forward to doing as much as I can to help you with some development stuff, especially in regards to the BMGs, and look forward to seeing what you can get the project to do as you continue to develop it.
Okay, thank you.